welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing. And currently we are in chapter 42. Does that number ring a bell for anybody?
Yes, the answer. It's the meaning of
The meaning
the
of life.
universe and everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I always thought that was pretty funny. I wondered at some point if he was what was his name? Douglas Adams? Is that who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide? I wonder if he had this chapter in mind because it's one of the few in the Tao Te Ching that actually gives some kind of like cosmology about, kind of where did things come from. I don't know. But in any case, here we go. The Meaning of Life, chapter 42. So we'll start with the going through a couple verses here or phrases. Tao gives birth to one, one gives birth to two, two gives birth to three, and three gives birth to the 10,000 creatures. Now, in this translation, they're saying creatures, but this is the same phrase we've been looking at in terms of the 10,000 things. So here we have something very abstract, but it seems to be kind of some way of talking about where did everything come from, or how did we get to this place, or how are the different things related. I want to take it just a little bit further, and then we'll back up and talk about what these numbers might mean. So then it says the 10,000 creatures or things carry yin and embrace yang. So here we have explicitly stated yin and yang, which have been in the background, and we've talked about how it has an influence in a lot of the other passages. This is actually the only place where it's explicitly stated in the Tao Te Ching. And then it says, they carry the yin and embrace the yang, flowing together in harmony. So here we have like the big picture kind of laying out each of the different sections. Let's kind of, well, maybe before I jump into what my thoughts were on this, oops. Any thoughts that come from you on what these 1, 2, 3, and 10,000 might actually refer to?
That was
Like,
my biggest question in terms of like, hey, I get the one, I don't get the 2 and 3. Why not 4? Why not 2 only? What are those kind of questions?
So when you say you get the one, how are you seeing that?
That was the emperor, the one that leads the people, right? That's what I've understood. That listens to Tao.
Okay.
The sage.
So if the one was the sage or the emperor, then how do the rest of those work in terms of if the one is the emperor and something is the emperor somehow gives birth to 2 and then 3 and then the 10,000 things, we would be saying that ultimately the 10,000 things are coming from the emperor. Would that make sense?
But now that you say that, no, it's supposed to be the other way around, right? Because 10,000 things is everything.
So the emperor would be part of the 10,000 things, right?
Yeah, excuse me, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just disproved my thought thinking, yes.
To me,
Anybody
this has
else?
always
Anybody
seemed
else?
to be about the activity of making distinctions, not like a cosmological formation story, but just a description of the nature of perception. Because raw, unfiltered perception, there are no distinctions. It's just everything is one thing. Like it's been said, this is how babies experience the world. It's just one. It's just a field of perception. They haven't learned to distinguish this from that, my body from other things, this thing from that thing. It's just all one thing. But as you learn to make distinctions in perception, then you can begin to tell the difference between this and that. Oh, this is my body. That's not my body. You know, this is one thing, this is another thing, this is hot, this is cold, that way is up, that way is down. And then as you become, as your perception becomes more refined, you can make more distinctions. You can distinguish this from this from this. You can distinguish three different things, three different sounds, or three different flavors, three different colors. And then the more uh, the more your perception develops, you can eventually perceive all the different distinctions that there are to be made. But ultimately, it seems to be saying that distinctions are in some sense sort of subjective, whether you see the universe as all one thing or whether you break it up into distinct parts in your head is in some sense just a mental activity.
I like that.
You got all of that from those few sentences?
Well, I've been thinking about it for a while.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
It's pretty good though.
Taylor, do you have any thoughts?
Nothing that can beat that.
Well, it's not a competition.
I know.
Everything is a
I'm just
competition.
kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. And I will tell you that even amongst the different commentators over the really millennia and the scholars involved in this, there is no agreement. So there wouldn't be any right or wrong answer here. You know, it's intentionally vague, and sometimes, you know, different schools of thought can get really caught up in like numerology type things and trying to understand what that might mean. It's interesting in thinking about the Chinese characters. If you're talking about the numbers 1, 2, and 3, they're each represented by essentially a horizontal line. So 1 is just one line, 2 is 2 horizontal lines, and 3 is 3 horizontal lines. After that, it changes and they become all different kinds of shapes that don't seem to represent the numbers as much. So, and I'd have to look back into this a little bit more, but I think there's some stuff in terms of historically, like from a cultural perspective, universally, that there's something about 1 through 3, and then there's many, or 3 actually means many, more than 2, but it could be any number more than 2. And that there were different ways of trying to count that basically was like a 3 thing, not a 5 or a 10, or, you know. So I wonder if there was some of that history in how the language was written and also how they were thinking about it here. I'm not sure, but
Are you thinking, Jim, of supposedly they're like primitive counting methods, like primitive peoples developed counting where like there's just 1, 2, 3, or many, and there's no numbers bigger than 3. It's just there's 3 or more than 3 is kind of that
or
kind of
or the
development.
3 actually incorporates more than 2, and it could be any number more than 2, right?
Right. It's just, in other words, instead of having a bunch of numbers, they just have 1, 2, and then many is like
Yeah.
all the numbering system that you know that certain primitive peoples developed at a point. You know, they
Yeah.
didn't have concepts for 5 or 10 or bigger numbers. They were just many.
Yeah. So I have a vague recollection of coming across that at some point, but I didn't actually. It was just now actually kind of occurring to me as we're having the conversation, and it would be interesting to go back and dive into that a bit to see what the correlation could be. But in any case, there's ways that this can be looked at. You know, one way, you know, that Dan was bringing up is maybe this is bringing into consideration the idea of making divisions in the one in terms of how we see things as separate and how that can multiply into all the various things that we recognize in terms of objects within our world. But in reality, it's all, as we've talked about, just part of that one. The other thing that's kind of interesting is clearly this idea of gives birth to is poetic in terms of how this is played out. It's not meant to be. So when it says Tao gives birth to one, we're not to understand this that somehow Tao is like some type of entity that has an intention that's saying, I'm going to create one, or something along those lines. And it's also interesting to note that there is no zero, which often happens. The zero is kind of a later creation in terms of thought. So it's not starting from zero and going to one. We've got Tao and this idea of one, which I think we can think of a little bit more in terms of unity. Maybe at the beginning where Dane was saying that, everything is actually one thing, but we break apart into these distinctions. We could understand Tao as a way of talking about or understanding the concept of one or unity. And then where does it go from there? So let me just jump then into the pieces that how I kind of see it. And this isn't, again, the definitive answer, because there is no definitive answer. So if we're saying one is the unity, right, that includes everything. It's that one thing is everything idea. Then the way I'm looking at two is that Tao, when we try to get a little bit more specific and when we start breaking things apart a little bit and we get into this idea of absence or Wu, Tao, and when we're thinking of absence as a concept, Tao becomes more the idea of patterns that exist within absence. And so you could almost see this as like the beginning point of how everything unfolds, that there's the substance that we call absence, and there's patterns that this absence that moderate or how absence functions, right? And then from that, then we get presence, which is where now we get obviously the 10,000 things. So we could see it almost as a way of not necessarily steps, but the components that make up how we understand that unity. Yes, there's everything is one thing, but within that one thing, there's this idea that there's patterns, and that at its core, there's this idea of absence. But when these patterns are acting on absence, we end up with presence. And that presence is what we recognize as the 10,000 things. And then from that, which is interesting in the way the text unfolds, is that the 10,000 things then are embracing and carrying the yin and the yang. So some of the other ways of interpreting this is two is frequently identified as yin and yang. So one would be Tao, two would be yin and yang. Three gets a little bit more interesting in terms of how they go from one to the other. But in how I'm understanding and seeing how the rest of the Daodejing is laid out, I don't see that fluctuation between absence and presence, that idea of existence, non-existence kind of an idea, as where that yin yang takes place. For me, the yin yang is within the sphere of presence, within the sphere of the 10,000 things is where we get those distinctions in terms of like long, short, light, dark, so forth. So this would be how I see that part of it unfolding. And I think it matches a bit more with what we've seen in the text so far. But it is a mystery. There is no definitive answer on this. This is just my take on it. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that before we continue with the rest of the passage. All good? All right.
Yeah,
would've
I don't think I
guessed
would have gotten that out of this if you hadn't laid it out. So thanks.
Well, again, this is just my thoughts on it.
Yeah.
I would have guessed that yin and yang would be associated with two.
Yeah, and that frequently is in the discussion. But even in the text of chapter 42, yin and yang doesn't come into play until we get to the 10,000 things, right? So it and how that, and maybe just to back up for a second. So the 10,000 things carry yin and embrace yang, flowing together into harmony. So that idea of the harmony is really a key aspect between the things, right? The 10,000 things then is where this attribute comes into play more so than the idea of balance doesn't work quite as well if you're talking about absence and presence. That's kind of more of an ongoing cyclical thing that is also ongoing change. But when we're talking about trying to do the balance or the harmony, it's within the 10,000 things, within the context of our experience of life, and not necessarily in the experience of absence. So just some thoughts. And I think in the bigger picture, how we look at the whole of the Tao Te Ching, it doesn't seem to use the concept of yin and yang in relationship to absence and presence, but more as it relates to the different things relating to each other. All right. So this is how it continues in. People hate being orphaned, lonely, and hungry. Yet this is what the kings and lords call themselves. So again, we're seeing right off, we can't escape the political implications of what's going on with the Tao Te Ching. It's always concerned not just at that individual level or about the individual psychology or philosophy, but also ultimately to the social sphere or the political sphere, which, because humans are so social in their makeup, that makes sense. You can't really address one without addressing the other. And here we see it being brought to the fore. We recently saw a very similar statement about kings and lords referring to themselves as orphaned, lonely, and hungry. This was in chapter 39, so it's a couple chapters ago. Do you recall how that phrase played out in that context? Or do you remember coming across that phrase? No? Okay, well, let's go back and look.
Vaguely, not enough to speak on it.
So let's just jump over there again for a second. So the section from chapter 39 where this comes into play, it says, noble has humble as its root. High has low as its foundation. Then rulers and lords call themselves poor, lonely orphans. Isn't this using humility as a root? So if we start with the first two lines there, noble has humble as its root, high has low as its foundation. What do you think is being referred to here?
When you say position, I'm thinking like, okay, we're talking about nobility here and being orphans. So if you're, oh, I remember now what we talked about. The people are really your foundation when you are in a position of, you know, when you're a politician, essentially, like your supporters are the people that believe in you.
Yeah, so there's a relationship then, right? That if you are in a position of leadership, it's for a reason, and that reason isn't actually yourself. It's that you are there to help lead. Shindao has an interesting phrase where he says the emperor does not, he says the emperor exists for the empire does not exist for the emperor. And you think about how, especially in modern day thinking, it seems like they get this really turned around, right? Where it's all for the benefit of the emperor or whoever's in control. They're taking advantage of the situation to, you know, for personal gain. And here,
Like Bond villains.
what's that?
Like Bond villains. I always have this thought whenever I watch a movie where there's like some, like where the the villain is like a cult leader, and he has this like army of assassins willing to throw away their lives. But I'm like, who are these people? Why are they following this maniac? Like, what is the benefit to them? Like, where does he get all these mindless drones to follow him?
You can
Who
ask that about a lot of
are
things
like,
in real life today.
I mean, who would work for a Bond villain? Really? I mean, I just I can't picture it.
Yeah.
They're out there.
Unfortunately, there's too many historical examples. Um, so it's a thing. And so I think what's being stated here isn't that it's it's a way of bringing that to the attention of those who either seek leadership or who are in leadership. It's almost like a wake-up call. Remember, that you're here because your origin, where you even came from, right? You started from somewhere. You didn't start as emperor. Maybe in cases where they have somebody who's like born into the position, but in general, there's like some kind of climb from somewhere other than the highest position to the highest position. And if they are recognizing this, then there's a way that the rulers, and I don't know if they actually did refer to them this way, or if this is more of an ideal ruler that the Tao is presenting in terms of referring to themselves as poor, lonely orphans. But we can see even in modern day politics how oftentimes the candidate running for office will try to show that they're one of the people, that they're just like the regular, blue collar worker, or that they had humble beginnings and they know what it's like. And there's an important aspect there that needs to be maintained. And so when we're thinking about the political situation that the Tao Te Ching is often calling for, in terms of this mirroring or using nature as a way to define what the political situation should look like, one of the key factors is that the ruler can't be using it for his own benefit, for his own desires. Frequently, you'll talk about the problem that you get into if the leaders are chasing their own ends as opposed to recognizing their obligation to the larger community that they serve. In fact, a fascinating concept for me that emerges is this idea of the mandate of heaven. And part of the idea here is that, if you're in a position of rulership, that it is something that is being allowed, in a sense, to happen because the leader is actually serving the people. But if the leader ceases serving the people, then that mandate can be taken away and given to another. And this is eerily similar to some of our like democratic ways of thinking about things. It's just, I think, really fascinating that at such an early time frame, these kinds of concepts are coming up in classical China. So we definitely have a concept here then that there is a transformation as well, right? That if the root is the source, or if humble is the source, if low is the foundation, then there is also this idea of transition, right? And so we can get this idea of yin yang, that yes, maybe at one point you were humble and low, and now you find yourself in this high position, but you have to recognize the foundation from which that's based, and also remember that it goes back around, that you're not actually different than all the other people, you're just positionally different, right? And that position has a value, and to the degree that it is recognizing itself as necessary or beneficial for the larger community. One other piece to bring in here is we've talked about how the Daodejing may be a memory of more of a Paleolithic perspective that is survived, that is reasserting itself through these teachings. And part of what happens in those in that prehistoric time, how those groups ended up being much more egalitarian and how they functioned is, looking at from more of a cultural anthropological perspective, is they were far more intentional about how they held their leaders in check based off of kind of like political coalitions that were asserting certain values of the community that the leader was expected to uphold. So frequently in these hunter-gatherer groups, even in the ones that still persist or did not too long ago in history, the leaders would have leaders, but they didn't have much in the way of power. The power was still with the people, and the people would have ways of sanctioning leaders that tried to get out of line, that became or tried to become like more dictatorial or become more involved for their own self-interest. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here, is that same concept being brought forward, and that the leaders need to recognize they're only positionally different, not substantially different, that they are still just people like everybody else.
Hey, Jim, have you ever read The Dawn of Everything?
I have begun that book. I have not finished it, but it's a very interesting introduction thus far.
Yeah, I think this came up once, but what I'm remembering from that is obviously talks a lot about kind of how primitive human societies sort of developed the concept and the position of a ruler, and one of the things is it may have started with like seasonal things, like where once a year during this month they would like make somebody the king or the make believe, like they would just be the king during that festival, and then
Mhm.
the rest of the year everybody would go back to the normal arrangements. But the period of time during which the king was appointed kind of became longer and longer and longer until it was kind of a full-time thing. That was one of the really fascinating uh, ideas from that. But what's also coming to mind is some experiments that I remember reading about, where having to do with sort of the sense of entitlement that people have when they have money, where basically they have people play Monopoly or some kind of game, but they give certain people more money. They have like certain people start off with more money, and they measured that like the people who are just randomly selected to have more money, they come to be sort of arrogant, and they take more of the pretzels, and they talk down the other players, and they come to develop this sense of like entitlement that they are ahead because they deserve to be ahead,
Yeah.
when really they were just randomly selected.
Mhm.
And so it seems to be a tendency in human nature that if you get put on a pedestal, it starts to go to your head, and you start to think you're better than everybody else. And this seems to be directly counseling against that tendency. Like just because you're on the throne right now doesn't mean you're special.
Yeah. And that's where the concept of position becomes really important in this line of thinking, because it's not about substance, that this is actually a person that's better than other people. It's a positional thing that's beneficial for the community to have that. So when you were talking, Dane, about the um, periodic uses of a leader, one of the other times that that would come into play is if they found themselves in a state of warfare, right? Is that it was advantageous to have somebody who was coordinating the activities if they found themselves at war with another tribe. Um, and so, but then it was short-lived and only for the duration of that, unusual circumstances. And even in a lot of the Native American tribes that they were looking at the beginning of that book, The Dawn of Everything, same kind of concept, where they didn't have a lot of actual power. They just had the ability to try and influence, but only to the degree that they were actually living up to the values of the community. And one of the other factors that comes into play for why that egalitarianism was so important was, or what seems to be driving it, was the desire for whatever amount of autonomy the individuals could have within the community. So they recognized in order for there to be a degree of autonomy, there had to be more of this egalitarian way of looking at things. And it frequently was not just in terms of power, but also in terms of material goods. So the hunter that comes back with the big game was expected to share that with the rest of the community. And so this idea of generosity was a big one. Lots of interesting dynamics of how these communities interacted with each other that seems to be really brought to the fore in this concept of rulers recognizing that their position is based in what was below. Yeah, key thing. And I think by them reusing this phrase then about the rulers referring to themselves as lonely orphans, poor lonely orphans, is bringing this concept back to mind in the chapter that we're looking at in chapter 42. So let me just back up to that. Yeah, so the people hate being orphaned, lonely, and hungry, yet this is what the kings and lords call themselves. So it's really bringing back the same concept from chapter 39 to recognize the relationship. So if we think about that yin and yang, that balance that's happening, that the 10,000 things are emulating or embracing and carrying, that from the rulership perspective, there's, if they're doing it right, they're keeping this in mind in terms of how everything has changed, how everything transforms one into the other, and so forth, including themselves and the position that they currently hold. So that continues. It says, so creatures sometimes weaken, but then gain strength. Sometimes strengthen, but then grow weak. So again, this yin yang, this transition, things are not always weak and things are not always strong. Sometimes there's this transition that happens between them, and maybe the time is quicker or shorter, but there's always this change. There's always this transition that happens or transformation that happens. He's going to bring it back to what he gets to. He says, I teach what others have taught. So evidently this is somewhat of a common saying that exists in the more general cultural context in which this derives. He says, hoodlums, which is a curious translation that this particular translator used. The phrase is actually getting into something that's more tyrannical, or we'll see that this is often translated in terms of like a violent man. So hoodlums, or a violent man, or a tyrant, says they don't die a natural death. So this is like that core statement then. I teach what others have taught. A violent man doesn't die a natural death. And then this is also actually that same line from Addiss and Lombardo, because it actually brings out that particular way of translating it. And so then he says, this is the basis of my teaching. Now, this is interesting, because is this in reference to the line, a violent man does not die a natural death, and that becomes the basis of his teaching, or is it the whole chapter that becomes the basis for his teaching? Kind of an interesting question. I think it can work either way, but we have to understand, so we start off with really looking at the nature of reality in a very poetic sense, with the idea that one gives birth to two, two gives birth to three, and then the 10,000 things, and they embrace the yin and the yang. So we have kind of an opening statement that's saying this is kind of the nature of reality, how reality functions. And then it gets into, the statement about leaders and how they need to recognize this yin yang concept of even who they are. And then it's reiterated when it says creatures are sometimes strengthened and then weaken and sometimes strengthen. So then it comes back then to this idea, says a violent man does not die a natural death. And this somehow is the basis, right? So what do you think is meant by this idea of the hoodlum or the tyrannical or the violent man does not die a natural death? We'll start with that.
I mean, at face value, it just seems like if you're going to be violent, then you're not going to experience life like to the fullest extent of what you should, and you'll probably die before you should.
I thought it meant live by the sword, die by the sword.
Yeah, to take that Christian line, yeah, it definitely brings that to mind as well.
Yeah, I was actually getting the same thoughts. Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you think this concept then, violent man does not die a natural death, fits into the rest of the chapter?
I'm gonna bow out of this one because I missed the first half.
Yeah. Well, at the beginning, it's talking about, one gives birth to two, two gives birth to three. But if you're dying not a natural death, then do you have time to contribute to that? This is all very literal in my head, unfortunately. I know
No,
it's not what
okay.
not what it is.
If that's the case, of one gives birth to two, two to three, whatever it said at the beginning, then a violent man does not die a natural death does make sense to that because he's not going to be a part of that cycle per se. It's going to be ripped out of that cycle because you're not taking part of that. You are, in essence, doing the opposite of that. Rather than giving, he's taking away, and then also he's getting taken away in an unnatural form.
Yeah. That's my thought too.
So when they were talking about the yin and yang, they were talking about how these flow together to create harmony. And a big part of what it was talking about at the beginning is how there's kind of a natural order and a flow. And part of that flow means that rulers need to recognize their place in things and not, in a sense, get a big head. So if that's the ideal, what would it mean that the violent person has done?
I mean, a violent person would disrupt the natural flow. The natural flow is to live and then die of natural causes. If a violent man is breaking that flow by dying of unnatural causes or causing death of unnatural cause in some cases.
And again, there's lots of different ways that this can be interpreted or thought about. So what I'll present isn't necessarily, again, the end all in terms of how we answer this question, but let me I'll share what my thoughts were on this here. So at the beginning, it starts with, Tao, and as it unfolds, it's showing how Tao is really this idea that patterns and the absence and the presence and the 10,000 things, that whole way that kind of the nature of what is, and that gives birth to what we perceive as the 10,000 things that then are embracing this yin and yang, and they fold them or breathe them together in such a way that it creates this harmony or this balance. So this would be the ideal, right? Tao is representing this balance of the forces of the yin and yang. So if that would be on the one hand, then we could see the violence would be holding on to one force. And the critique we're seeing a lot in the Tao Te Ching is that there's too much yang. Yang would have to do with the idea of that control and that order, whereas yin is more about that novelty, or maybe even understood as chaos, this newness, this difference. It's not about how do we get everything to conform, but it's how do we, if we're taking yin and yang together, then there's this balance between order and chaos, between how do we take the uniqueness of the different things and blend them together so that there's a harmony, as opposed to if we were approaching it all from a yin perspective, or excuse me, a yang perspective, it's almost like trying to flatten it out to make it level. Again, the concept of the carved wood, how do we take and make everything uniform so it conforms, as opposed to being able to embrace those differences. And so if someone is going to persist in wanting to maintain something a particular way and resisting that change, that natural cycle or that natural harmony, we might actually talk about it in terms of doing violence to a concept or violence to an idea, right? And so here the idea of violence is holding on to that one, which may be what the Taoists are critiquing the warring states period by saying we've got way too much yang going on here. There's way too much of this idea of control and how do we make everything fit a certain pattern, instead of understanding the flow and being part of that ongoing regular balance and harmony. So this is where I see them talking about the violence or the violent man, is that it is the social crisis of the warring states period is a result of somebody holding on to one aspect of this natural balance and trying to force that. And that would be where that violence is coming from, and how it doesn't last, the consequences they're experiencing in that warring states period of, unrest and killing and destruction, right? So I think that would make sense, how he can then conclude everything by saying this becomes the basis of my teaching, is that it's this absence of balance, of recognizing the yin and the yang, that is necessary for a leader to have a proper humility of understanding their positional place in this context of the larger community, and how that's supposed to operate within more of a harmony with nature at large. Whereas what has devolved in the culture at that point is rulers who were in it for themselves, who were taking political advantage, and once they have that advantage, doing everything they can to hold on to it or cause everything else to conform to it, which would then be seen as violence and an imbalance of that yin yang, and hence the foundation for what they're trying to get across, and potentially the Daodejing as a whole.
Muted because I sneezed. Yeah, that makes sense.
Maybe we'll jump out here for a second and just see what some thoughts are on this. Now, obviously, this is addressing the idea of lords and kings, but we can also take this and think about it in terms of our own personal, where we have control, but also at the level of like managers or corporations, or city government, or all different kinds of levels where this can come into play. Does that dynamics of understanding that larger context of what the reality is made up with, and seeing it through that lens of yin and yang, and in terms of how to operate, give you any insights into how you might want to either be practicing in your own lives or critiquing systems that you happen to be a part of?
Yeah, I think it all boils down to balance in pretty much every aspect of life. Yeah, I don't know. I think I have to stew on it for a little while.
Anybody else have some thoughts?
Well, one thing that's occurring to me is the question, is violence really against the way of nature, because there does seem to be a lot of violence in nature. So maybe that too is part of the way of nature.
Well, it's interesting because violence has a certain, let's say, value judgment associated with it. Right. So if we,
But at the least, it's subjective. You know, are you doing violence or are you eating? Right. It's like, who's to
yes,
say what violent? And you know, is it violent when a supernova happens? You know.
right. And we might use that term, but we're using it somewhat poetically, right? But when a tsunami happens or something like that, we wouldn't say that there's actually any type of bad intent in the sense of violence from a, let's say, ethical perspective, or when a lion eats a gazelle or a, an orca eats a seal or something along those lines. We can say that it looks violent, but it's not actually the right way to call it something like violence, right? There's definitely a concept at the core of biology that is life feeds on life. And there isn't any way around that, right? Even if you're talking about a vegetarian, you're still eating other life. And even plants themselves grow because there's the decomposing matter of previous life. So all life, in a sense, feeds on life. But we wouldn't necessarily call that violence unless there's some kind of other intent that comes into play, which usually requires humans. So we might say that humans have done violence in the way that they either farm or slaughter animals, but there's also a way to do it that we would not necessarily call violent. Or if they, just are indiscriminately killing for no particular reason, we would call that violent. So there's different ways we can kind of deconstruct what that concept of violence would be. But yes, there's definitely, if we're looking at how nature works, we can't rule out the idea at a fundamental level that life feeds on life at some point. But what is the harmony and balance in that? How does that happen in nature as opposed to how we sometimes execute it in our human ways of doing things? Do you ever find like I know with myself, sometimes I'll find myself getting stuck on trying to keep something a certain way and resisting change, or in trying to control stuff to the degree that it won't change. And I have to like stop myself and kind of think, okay, is this actually helpful, or am I causing more issues by not being more responsive to the natural tendency of things to go through these cycles? Do you ever run into those issues?
My Shifu said the first two fundamental defects of Kung Fu: don't resist and don't insist.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
And
so. I think it's easy for humans to resist change. Or try to, at least.
Yeah.
there's probably a distinction to be made, like violence in the physical senses and atoms, atomic bonds coming apart, you know, and violence in the subjective senses in wishing harm upon others.
Yeah, for sure. It is an interesting to think about if
You can
nature.
have a violent thought, you know, that doesn't actually change anything in the physical world, but it's still a violent thought.
Mm, yeah, that's true too. Lots of ways I think we can take what's being modeled here and look at it even in our personal, but I think it also becomes interesting in how we use it to critique other situations around us where we see abuses of power happening. Um, and especially in looking at our political systems, where has things gone off the rails? And we can start to use some of these critiques for some of that as well. How has our politics become a situation where someone seeks it for personal benefit? And what kinds of things could we do if we wanted to work towards shifting that balance so that there was a different perception of how public office was held or what the requirements were for that are. It's also interesting, I think, to look at the kind of the distinctions between how, at least in the US, our form of government trying to operate from the position of this Constitution, which is in a sense defining that populist ethos that the rulers are supposed to live up to, right? That even has within its statement, that all, and again, this is a product of the time, that all men are created equal. That whole way of thinking should become part of that basis, or we have the mechanisms in place for how that becomes part of the basis of how we hold our leaders accountable. But part of the challenge there is all the other public or personal and self-interest that have crept into the political system. So even though it doesn't give us any easy answers, it maybe gives us some good tools for how we critique the public life, the politic life that we participate in, and maybe give some direction on what the way forward might look like, or might be helpful to pursue. All right, guys. Well, we're at time, but I definitely enjoyed our time together. And if you've been watching this on video and you'd like to join us, you can go to kinship.cafe, www.kinship.cafe, and register your email, and you'll get links to the latest videos, as well as links to participate in our Friday morning Zoom conversation. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area, if you wanted to meet in person. So that'll be it for today. Look forward to seeing everybody next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.
Take care.